The panel lines on the rear of the fuselage were missing from this model kit. However, this was an easy fix by using a permanent marker and scale drawings by marking out where the missing lines should be. Once the lines were marked out, the lines were scribed into the model using both a Tamiya panel line scriber and Dymo embossing tape with multiple light passes of the scriber across the marked surface. I soon had a nice set of panel lines. Then it was time to paint the interior of the fuselage. Instead of going for the Flying Tigers paint scheme that came in the kit, I decided to go for another paint scheme. In this case, the paint scheme of a UK-based Royal Air Force P40-B. Having found painting instructions online, the camouflage was drawn onto the model with a pencil. I first painted the camo bands in a mixture of thin dark green black paint, applied with both a small round head and a flathead paintbrush. After the first coat of paint was dried, the first coat of dark green was applied in the same way. After a second coat of dark green, I painted an outline around the green bands with a dark brown colour using a small round head paintbrush. I then blended over a dark earth with a hint of Middlestone colour for the highlights, which was painted over the top of the wings and fuselage. Then it was a matter of painting the rest of the model. The chosen paint scheme for this model will depict the markings of this RAF P40, a part of the first Curtiss Tomahawks to enter service with the RAF, stationed in England in early 1941. Now, I should point out that this kit does not come with RAF decals, only the decals for a Flying Tigers P40. However, this gave me the opportunity to use up my stock of spare decals. In this case, the spare World War II era RAF decals from my collection. So, I applied the spare decals using Microscale and Microset decal solutions, starting with applying the decals on the top of the wing. After applying the spare RAF decals, it was time to make a set of serial number decals in photo editing software, in this case Adobe Photoshop Elements. Once done, the serial numbers were printed onto clear inkjet decal paper. Then 2 coats of Microscale Decal Film were brushed over the sheet, with 24 hours between each coat of film. Once dry, the decals were applied onto the model, and with the decaling completed, it was time to attach the rest of the parts to the model. And with the last parts glued onto the model, this project was completed. Thank you so much for watching this video, and good luck with all your ongoing scale modeling projects. Here it is, the completed model.